All right, now the final part, submitting the form. Let's say we're going to build a contact form with two fields, name and email. So I'm going to add an input field and give it a placeholder, name. Now duplicate and change this to email. Finally, we add a button for submitting the form. So we set type to submit. Now there is another way to add a submit button. We can add an input of type submit. So here we set the value to submit, and now we get two identical buttons. So we can use either of these approaches to add a submit button. But what is the difference? Well, with the input element, we can only type plain text here, so we cannot add an icon. If we want to add an icon, we have to use the button element, because in between the opening and closing tags, we can type HTML code. So here we can add an I element with three classes, FAS, which is short for Font Awesome Solid, and Font Awesome -alert. Now, I personally prefer to use the button element because even though we have an input of type submit in HTML, submit buttons are not really input fields. So conceptually, I have problem with this approach, but that is irrelevant. So we have a button with a simple label. Now, for submitting the form, there are two attributes you need to know. The first one is action, and this is where we're going to send the data. So here we have to type a relative or an absolute URL. But what is behind that URL? Well, this is where server-side technologies come in the picture. There's so many server-side technologies out there, like Express, which is used by JavaScript developers, Django, which is used by Python developers, C# developers use ASP.NET, PHP developers use Laravel, Ruby developers use Ruby on Rails, and so on. There are, of course, many, many more. You don't need to learn all of them. Depending on the language you know or you prefer to use, you can pick one of these frameworks to build the backend. But in this course, our focus is on the front end, not the back end. So to keep things simple, we're going to use a fantastic service called formspree.io. So head over to this website, create a new account. It's absolutely free. Then you can create a project, and within each project, you can have one or more forms. So I've created a project here, my first project. Now let's add a form here. I'm going to call this contact form. Now let's create the form. All right. Now the backend is built for us. So all we have to do is to copy this URL and paste it over here. So we're pasting an absolute URL that points to a different website. Now, the second attribute we need to set here is method, which can be either get or post. I'll talk about the difference in a second. Now, to submit a form, each input field should have a name attribute. So I'm going to set the name attribute of the first input field to name. And for the second input field, we're going to set the name to email. Good. Now let's submit the form. So real quick, and submit. Beautiful. Our form was successfully submitted. Now back to Formspree. Here we have the submissions tab. So we have one new submission. We get a report. We can see who submitted the form with what values. We also get an email notification. So Formspree makes things a lot easier. We don't always have to build backends. They also integrate with different services. So we can send a user a custom email. We can do all kinds of things. So to submit the form, there are two attributes we need to set on the form element. Action, which is where we are sending the data, and method, which is how we are sending the data. But what is the post method? Well, when we use this method, these fields like name and email and their values will be included in the body of the request. So back to the browser, let's open up Chrome DevTools and go to the network tab. Now let's see what happens when we submit the form. So submit, good. So take a look. On the top, we have an HTTP request sent to formspree.io. The method is post. Now let's inspect this request. So we select it. Here in the headers tab, down the bottom, look at form data. So we have two fields, name and email, and you can see their values. So these values are included in the body of the HTTP request. This is the most common approach for submitting form data. Now, if we change the method to get, our fields will not be included in the body of the request. Instead, they're going to be appended to the target URL. Let me show you. So let's submit this form one more time. All right, now look at the target URL or action. After the question mark, we have a series of name value pairs. So here's the first pair, name equals Mosh. Then we have an ampersand followed by the second pair, email equals whatever. Now, when do we use the get method? This is used in situations where we want to bookmark this URL, so we can always get back to it. A real example is Google. So when we go to Google and search for something like book, so if you look in the URL, somewhere over here, you should find the keyword that I searched for. That is book right here. So now we can always bookmark this URL and get back to it. This is the benefit of the get method. Again, as I said, most of the time, we use the post method. So we send the user to the target URL, and then perhaps we redirect them to somewhere else.